There's only 24 hours in a day. I got a pair of earbuds and I wish there was a way that I could know just what I want to listen to. There's 150,000 shows that I'm not sitting through. When the world is dark and boring, let us do your exploring. Pod on pod. Pod on pod.
Welcome to Pod on Pod, a guide to the world of podcasts because it's not your daddy's radio. We're your hosts.
I'm Josh.
And I'm Joel. This week, we're going to be discussing the Marth and Eric podcast. This is a little bit off the beaten path for us, and I want to preface it a little bit just because for the next 2 weeks, we're going to do something that we hadn't done yet, but we want to make a more regular feature of the show. We're not normally going to do it back-to-back like this, but we got a lot of submissions. We asked for them, and suddenly we got them. Imagine
and
that.
They appeared.
Yeah. We got some submissions for people that wanted us to review their show. We've got a few criteria that we generally like to adhere to. First of all, we made a very arbitrary rule early on that we're actually going to break right off the top. Not this week, but next week we're going to break. You and I said we weren't going to review a show with less than 20 episodes.
Correct.
And the thought was so many podcasts bail out early on. You don't want to be excited about a show to promote it to our audience and to people that we talk to and then have it not go anywhere. But next week we're going to review a show. I'll go ahead and give you a sneak preview. It's called the Monat Dixon Line. We're going to review that podcast next week, and I think there's only currently 9, maybe 10 episodes of that out. But I'll tell you next week why it's an exception. So that's one of the things that we do. We try to have at least 20 episodes of a show recorded and produced before we review it. We also only review a show if we can say something positive about it.
That's not true.
No, I think for me it's true. I'm not going to put forth a show if all I've got to say is negative things. And I'll tell you, and you brought up the Joe Rogan experience, which I had very negative things to say about. First of all, Joe Rogan is super famous, way more famous than I am, and his podcast has way more listeners than our podcasts. Any of them, all of them combined have, probably ever will have. It's punching up, even if I was really ugly and mean. And I don't think I was mean. I had some good things to say about him and his show. I had some negative things to say about him and his show.
Look, it's going to be the nature of what we do. If I have spent hours of my life listening to something and I can warn a listener away from doing that same thing, I'm going to.
Oh, yeah, sure. Absolutely. But at the same time, we generally discuss at some point, even if one of us doesn't like a show, we talk about why someone might, why there is an audience for this show, especially when we review well-known or generally popular shows.
But sometimes I'm going to be honest, that's to make myself feel okay about spending my time doing it.
Okay, well, I guess that's a selfish reason.
I don't like it, but I can see why somebody would.
So, but particularly though for smaller shows, for shows that get submitted by one of their listeners or by the producer or the co-host itself, we're not going to review it and put it on the feed if we're going to just rip you apart. So that's a little hint here. This show that we're going to review today, the Marth and Eric podcast, we generally liked.
And I think it's because it's a difference. It's like film, right? You have a studio show and you have an indie film, man.
Yeah, and indie film is judged in some ways on a slightly different scale.
Right.
Absolutely. Yeah, and I think you'll hear that in our review today. So what we do on this show, in case this is your first episode, is we break down a different podcast every week for you, discussing it with 4 criteria in mind, especially audio quality, host likability, production values, and then the content itself. We do some fun stuff at the end too, like give the show alternate names, discuss our favorite moment, and then rate it overall by giving it earbuds. We rate things not with thumbs up or with stars or legs of lamb. Everybody's got a different rating system. Our rating system is earbuds. We give it a 1 or 2 earbuds. Josh here in particular likes to give things a half earbud. You think it's a symbolic gesture?
Yes.
Well, we'll see how this show fares. First of all, we should introduce you to these hosts. It's Marth and Eric, 2 buddies who are fast approaching 30. They discuss anything and everything in existence, all the while applying their unusual sense of humor and mutual love of all things nerd-related. That's the canned intro to the show. You can find it and more about them at underratedretro.com, underratedretro.com. They launched the show in March of 2013, and I personally listened to episode 58, 62, 64, and I'm actually about 3/4 through 69 right now.
I listened to 68. The first one, I can't even remember. I've listened to like 5.
And you and I were kind of having a little cheat conversation on the way into the studio today. We both feel like this is going to be a show that we're going to stick with. So you in particular don't care about the numbers of episodes you listen to because you're going to end up listening to more, a lot more of them. Let's get right to it. This show is different than a lot of the shows that we've listened to. And one of the things that kind of turned me off, I'll admit, with the first episode that I listened to is that they start the show with a skit, a little radio play.
Yeah, see, I liked that part. It was different.
I liked it too eventually, once I got the hang of it, which brings us to one of the ways that we discuss shows. When we review a show here on Pod, we always listen to at least 3 episodes, and most of the time we try to listen to 4 or 5 each. Sometimes we both have an episode in common. Sometimes we'll listen to a wide array of episodes and we don't cross over. But the whole point of that is that you don't really get the language of a show, the rhythms of a show. You don't understand any of the in-jokes. You're not expecting the way things are coming at you. And it's hard to get your bearings until you're 2 or 3 episodes in to listening to it. So even if the content is good for you, even if you really do like the hosts, even if it's got the right format that would appeal to you, you're not necessarily going to know that right away. And that was definitely the case for me. I started listening to the show. I've been following Marth and Eric on Instagram because they're very funny guys. They have a great Instagram account, by the way, MNE Podcast. Check them out there. And they make memes. They make these funny little jokes. They're podcasters, and we've got a couple of podcasts that I try to promote on all the social media, since you're not really a guy that lives on the internet at all.
And that is one of the things that I found very interesting of the show that is probably unique to me, and a lot of listeners may not attach themselves to that part of the show, which is we're slightly older than they are.
Yeah, just a little bit.
But it's enough of a gap to really be generational.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. We went to high school in different periods of time.
Right. And some of the things that they talk about, especially when it comes to technology, I'm not very familiar with. So it's like, it's kind of a glimpse into something that I don't know a whole lot about.
It's like, these crazy kids on my lawn, what are they doing with their gizmos and their cell phones and their pages?
Here's an example, which is something I bet you've never even thought about, and you do a great job with promotions. Have you thought about doing anything with Xbox Live?
No.
They have.
I know. Not until the other day, actually. Who was it?
Xbox Live to promote a podcast. That's crazy. They've gathered an audience by getting people who listen to the podcast or people who play Xbox Live to, I don't know anything about Xbox Live.
Yeah, so it's like, it would literally be like, we would be the creepy old guys showing up to the prom.
But
Hey, you guys like podcasts over here? You guys like podcasts? We got a whole bunch of podcasts in this van out here in the parking lot. It'd be a little weird. I don't know. So anyway, but they start with the skit, and the first, we got way off topic. We started doing our second show there for a minute. Anyway, their first skit hit me wrong, and I don't remember which one it was. I don't remember which episode I listened to first, but for whatever reason, it didn't strike me as that funny. And I was like, oh, look at these. This is why there's a million of these comedy podcasts out there in the world. And then I started listening to their show in general. First of all, I thought it was a little cute. Their theme song is Bit Tunes. It sounds like, old Nintendo games and stuff. I think it's Hurt by the Nine Inch Nails, I think.
Sometimes it's a different song.
Oh, really?
Yeah.
But also in Bit Tune? That's cool.
Either that or Bit Tune just sounds different to me every time.
I don't speak this chip tune.
Anyway. Chip tune. I was way off.
No, it's bit tune.
Okay.
I was trying to... Anyway, so they start off with that, and our other podcast has a bit tune theme song. So I was a little bit. I felt there was a camaraderie there. Then you get into the show itself, and it's just two buddies talking, kind of like these podcasts that we do. Yeah. And I was like, oh, all right. Well, there's this. And the conversation is dense. They've been friends a long time. They've been doing this podcast a long time. And they don't provide much of an on-ramp. And that's one negative that I'll say right here. There's no window in.
If you go back and look, I took a journey with these guys because I do find them relatable. We've done a podcast for over 2 years. That's pretty similar.
Yeah, it's a similar time frame. They launched in like March of 13, so they're like 70 episodes in now, I think.
And what I did was once I understood what their concept was and how they're running the show, I went back to listen to episodes to see if they made the same pitfalls we made, or if they evolved as we evolved, or how their timeline followed our timeline. So that kind of endeared them to me, and it's probably shading my entire opinion and view of the show. But I do have a couple of things that won't be as biased.
All right. Well, why don't we go ahead and get into the categories themselves? We like to discuss shows. Well, first of all, we just like to discuss podcasts, but then we like to talk about them specifically with these 4 categories. This is how we break a show down: audio quality, host likability, production values, and content itself. Audio quality first on this show. First of all, they are in the same place, which is great. Co-location is good for a podcast, right? And the audio quality is solid there. It's the same guy to guy. Now, they're not in a professional studio.
No.
And they don't have $300 or $400 mics, probably, right?
It's one of my least favorite parts of the show.
Yeah, I mean it's a little rough, but it's doable. And once you get used to it, like once you're on that level, it's not hard to listen to.
I would say the audio quality is probably middle of the road. There's a lot of people better than them, and there's a lot of podcasts not as good when it comes to audio quality.
Yes. Now I'm going to stick this into audio quality still, although maybe it bridges over into our next category, host likability. But a lot of times there's a problem with a two-handed podcast. We talked about this when we reviewed the Scarborough Country, which, by the way, they still refer to it on their show as County all the time, and it ticks me off every time. When we talked about that show, though,
but you're still listening to it?
Go back and go back and listen to the archives of Pod on Pod. Podonpod.com is where you can see those or listen to those. We talked about it in that episode. Sometimes you have voices that are too similar, and it becomes hard to follow a conversation. You're like, who said what and when as they're talking over each other. That's not the case here. These guys, they have voices that are more similar than yours and mine, perhaps, but they're not so similar, and their speech patterns aren't so similar that you get crossed wires or anything, even though the levels are the same. Host likability, I like both these guys. And even when I didn't like the podcast so much, my heart was with them. They won me over, though, on Instagram and Twitter and stuff. Like, I was already into them.
I do feel like they're a bunch of punk kids, man. I do.
With all the negative connotations to that, or all the good connotations? Like, oh, you punk kids.
Both.
You.
I mean, truly, I'm really not that much older than them, but I feel like I am.
First of all, neither one of them are married, right? I didn't hear anything about wives for either one of them.
Correct.
And I know for a fact neither one of them have kids, because if you have kids, you talk about it all the time.
Yeah, and that could be they're just maybe they're still in a part of their life that I remember very fondly.
Oh, and so you're like you're jealous, and because of your jealousy, you're like, you punk kids.
Maybe. I find myself like sometimes they'll talk. I think it was Eric. Maybe it could have been Marth. Who knows? But they talked about how one of them has gone through a lot of jobs.
Okay.
And he's like, yeah, I stayed up playing video games all night one night, and I just didn't go back. And then he's like, I had an air bubble in one of my lungs, so I had to miss work, and I was in the hospital, and they knew it. But whenever I got back to work, they were like, sorry, this isn't going to work out. Like, he's been through a ton of jobs. Some of them have literally lasted like 3 days, and some of them had lasted a while. But every time, like, they kind of put that attitude up on a pedestal like it was cool.
Well, but some of that's probably just played for laughs, right? I mean, it is a comedy podcast.
I don't know, maybe. But I was like, oh, what a lazy, no good.
The bums lose, sir. The bums will always lose.
Let me redo that one. Because you're going to have to edit that out.
I'm so tired of these monkey fighting snakes on this Monday to Friday plane.
Yes. You can just edit any of those in as you'd like.
All right.
There was moments like that.
Yes.
That made me like, man, what a... And then the connection of, man, I've kind of been through, like, there's one part where they really make fun of fat people. And that's not something you're really going to get on a sponsored podcast. Like, you're not going to ostracize a group of listeners like that.
That's true.
And it just struck me as, it's probably not the smartest thing. But then I thought, well, that's them. If I could describe this podcast in one word, it would be raw. Like, they're learning as they go. And in fact, on the first one, the beginning of it is them joking around, much like we did, because we wanted to put something out there that we were proud of, and we wanted to put something out there. So we put a lot of work into it and edited it, and some of the stuff didn't make it in. And we would make comments like, wow, that intro wasn't very enthusiastic. Let's do it again. And they have some of the exact same conversations in their first episode.
Well, I think that's just the natural progression of being an artist at all. Here's the thing that I'll say about Raw. You're not going to discover Joe Rogan. You're not going to be able to share Joe Rogan with your friends and be the guy that showed them. You're not going to be able to discover WTF with Mark Maron for your buddies. You might be able to discover Pod on Pod for your buddies, though. You can share us, but also
shameless.
You're very likely to be the first friend in your group to listen to the Marth and Eric podcast, and it might be the exact thing that you guys end up talking about when you get together for coffee or drinks on Friday night or whatever it might be. And let me just say, as a guy who ends up talking a lot about things that we hear on podcasts, and not just when we were reviewing them on this podcast, that's worth something. So anyway, I'm really enjoying the show. The host likability is there. Marth and Eric, you mentioned it earlier. I do have I can't remember which one is which, but I don't have a hard time listening to them as far as the conversation goes. Production values is pretty simple. You got an intro music, you got some outro music.
No, dude, they put some time and effort
into the skits, into the plays. Yes. The radio
sometimes,
plays.
Sometimes, I mean, they just...
well, you can tell which ones took them a long time, which ones took them not so long.
Yeah.
But here's the thing, though. You and I don't make a little weekly play with our podcast, do we?
I don't have time for that. I've got responsibilities, man.
Well, and look, as many people are getting into podcasting, very few people are doing that level of creativity in it. Even Kevin Smith talks about how easy it is. You just open the mic and talk. And you and I have talked a lot on this show about how a lot of podcasts could do with more editing. Here's an example of where these guys are doing editing. And occasionally they'll hear, well, no, look, a lot in the skits, in the plays, they'll let you hear outtakes afterwards where they did.
Sure.
Yeah, I did 3 takes of The Wizard or whatever, you know?
But in their natural course of conversation for the show.
No. They don't edit the conversations. But I think they give you a little bit of both. Hey, here's a show, and here's the behind the scenes of us goofing off. Here's the raw versions of us. Someday, I think, one or both of these guys is going to end up in a position where people will be going back to this podcast like they now go back and listen to, I don't know, Kurt Cobain's song that he wrote at 16 in high school, or like a notebook or something. I'm not saying these guys will be famous, but the fact of the matter is you're hearing comedy in its rough draft form. And I think there's something to that as a guy who really enjoys both comedy and the kinds of funny conversations that you can only have in podcasting. I think I made my point. So the content itself, what do you think? Is this show worth it?
Yeah, here's the thing. They tried in the beginning to do like segments, like bucket list. What's on your bucket list? And video games are going to be the intro into what got their conversation started.
Well, they're on underratedretro.com, which is at least mildly video game geared.
Right. And I would say that sometimes there's video game talk, sometimes there's not.
Right.
But yeah, I generally enjoy the content for the simple fact that they're crude, it's an explicit show, it's crass, and you think that that's them and that's all that's to them, and then they'll drop like a knowledge bomb on you.
I do really, really like that. They both bring to the show, hey, this is the historical character that I read about this week, or here's the incredible invention that's going to revolutionize our lives over the next 10 years. And they always discuss it in a ridiculous way because it's two, goofballs talking about it. But that's what most conversations between two guys are like. So I kind of like hearing that too.
Right. So
I like that part
I'm
of it.
glad that they do a little of both. It helps break up a show that could have a lot of monotony in it.
You got any favorite moments from the show? I had one in particular, episode 58. I think the name of the show was like Ewok this way or something like that. They talked a lot about Star Wars in the show, but there was a moment where they referenced sarlacklove.com as a great website that they were promoting. It was a long discussion about Star Wars interspecies mating. As a big Star Wars nut, that made my day. Also, in episode 62, they did their impression of popular music in Quebec. It was just a lot of like, woot, woot, which is exactly how all modern music sounds to me. So even though we got that generational shift, hey, they're doing a little bit of those crazy kids get off my lawn too. Those crazy Quebecers get off my lawn.
Of all the skits that I listened to at the beginning, the Leonardo da Vinci one tickled me.
Oh, we were talking about that before we started
Yeah.
recording. So the basic plot line there is it's Leonardo da Vinci. He's come back from the dead somehow or something. I can't remember how. Anyway, he's there. He's pitching. I've got a
New
lot
inventions.
I've got a lot of unpublished ideas for inventions, except all of his inventions are effectively sex
Toys. Yeah. And it's like, oh, that's already been made.
So one of the funny things that we like to do on Pod is give the show alternate names. A lot of thought goes into the title of a show, but sometimes we can come up with a more descriptive title. I'd call this show It's All Afterglow, because the whole point is creativity. It's an arts and entertainment podcast. They do like a 2-minute radio play at the beginning, and then there's a 45-minute show that's mostly just them like, hey, man.
I think I thought a good title would be While We Figure It Out.
While we figure it out. You sit and listen. How about underrated improv instead of underratedretro.com? Not so much? All right. How about the Mirth and Heretic podcast? Because it's funny and also explicit. No?
No, that one's bad too. Self-contained.
How self-contained?
Because it's like being invited into their bubble.
Oh, all right. Look at that. Look at that. I was going to make fun of you, and then you brought it all back together at the end of it.
Yeah, sometimes whenever I'm listening to it, I just picture like they're just two astronauts in space, right? And the only people they have to talk to are each other.
It's how it feels sometimes in this room, too. So you've heard all of this discussion, and you think, that's all swell, fellas. I just wanted to know whether you liked it or not. Can you rate it for me, perhaps? We try to do that every week here, too. Pod on Pod, we don't give it stars. We don't give it thumbs up or anything like that. We give it earbuds. We can give it 0.5. We can give it 1. We can give it 2, all the way up to 4 possible earbuds once you count the two of us together. I'm going to give the Marth and Eric podcast, you can find them and more about them at underratedretro.com. I'm going to give them 1.5 earbuds.
Oh, wow.
I like the show a lot. It's not for everybody. It's explicit. And as you described it, it's raw. But it is really funny. It's really genuine. It's consistent. These guys are putting it out there. They've been doing it since March of 2013, and they got 70 episodes already. 1.5 earbuds.
I am probably going to listen to several episodes. I may not listen to them all, but I am going to keep in contact with this podcast. I can't see giving it higher than a 1.
I can understand that.
I think,
especially in light of the other shows that you've only given a 0.5 or a 1.
Well, I think people who enjoy podcasting are going to be the people who find the show and find worth in the show. I think people who are listening for like ESPN or NPR, which I think is probably a good majority of people who consume podcasts.
Right. They're going for the bigwigs.
Yeah, will not get it at all.
I think that's fair. I also think that it matters a lot demographically. We've got some listeners that, are maybe in their late 40s, 50s, 60s, whatever, listening to podcasts for the first time. However, if you're younger than us, if you're 24, 25 years old, I don't know, maybe this is right up your alley, even if you are a quote-unquote normal guy. Anyway, that's 1.5 and 1 from you. That means it's 2.5 overall, sir. Pretty good for the Marth and Eric podcast. You got any final thoughts for those guys?
Yeah, I'm just glad that it was omitted.
No,
because
absolutely.
I would have never found it, searched for it, thought about it until it was submitted.
Absolutely. A very wise man once told my mother, and she passed it on to me, toot thine own horn, for the self-same shall not be tooted. If you don't promote yourself, nobody else is going to. Don't break your arm patting your own back, but, do it once in a while because it'll get cold otherwise. Anyway, the Marth and Eric podcast, you can find them all over the web at MNE Podcast. You can find them on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook as well, I think. Thanks to those guys for submitting the show, and yeah, we really enjoyed it. Next week, you're going to hear like the whole flip side. We talked about a podcast this week that's generationally maybe a little younger than us. Next week, we're going to talk about the Monat Dixon Line from Donald Monat and June Dixon. Really cool podcast. You can hear more about that next week right here at podonpod.com. If you're liking this show, drop by iTunes or Stitcher and write a review about us. That'll help other people just like you find us. Until next week, I'm Joel.
And I'm Josh. And Marth and Eric are now off of our bucket list.
Are you wanting something funny? Are you wanting something smart? A show on astral projection or the history of art? Do you want to learn a language or how to play guitar? Just leave it up to Joel and Josh. Pod on pod. Pod on pod.
Pod on Pod is a proud member of the Procast Network, a Procreate production. Procreate is a community of artists in film, music, the digital arts, and fine arts that helps connect and collaborate on projects. You can find out more at www.teamprocreate.com. Also, be sure to check out the non-content podcast if you're a fan of gaming and or anime. The Pod on Pod theme song is written and performed by Adam Dale. Find his music in iTunes and more information about him on our website. Our musical guest this week is
Lucas Selig.
and you can find more information about them in the description.